The Conqueror video ended with a question. What would have happened if the Cold War had got hot? The crew who served on it called it guesswork, but in 1991, 120mm HESH actually met Soviet-era armour for the first time, and the results weren't guesswork at all. They were forensic. That question, the one nobody could answer when the last Conquerors were pulled from British Army of the Rhine service around 1966, had been hanging in the air for a quarter century when Challenger 1 tanks rolled into southern Iraq, carrying the grandchild of the very same gun. Same calibre, same rifled bore, same type of ammunition. And on the other side of the engagement, Soviet-designed armour made of homogeneous steel, which is exactly what the IS-3 was made of. The evidence was always there, it just hadn't been assembled in this specific context. So, let's assemble it. But to understand why the evidence matters, why anyone should care about a 65-tonne tank that never fired in anger, you have to go back to Berlin. Not the Berlin of the Wall, the Berlin of September 7th, 1945, 4 months after the European War ended, when the Allies held a joint victory parade through the shattered city, and the Soviets decided to make a point. 52 IS-3 heavy tanks rolled through the Allied sectors that day. Western military observers, British, American, French, watched them pass and understood immediately that every tank in the Western arsenal was obsolete. The IS-3's pike nose hull, that sharply angled wedge of steel that deflected everything, was unlike anything they'd encountered. The massive 122mm gun was already proven against German heavy armour, and the overall protection level, 110mm plates at extreme angles on the hull, 220 to 250mm of cast steel on the turret front, was beyond what any Western tank gun in service could reliably defeat at combat ranges. British intelligence assessments in the weeks that followed were blunt. The Centurion, which had only just entered service in the final weeks of the war, couldn't guarantee a kill on the IS-3 at the ranges a European engagement would demand. The 20-pounder gun was good. It wasn't good enough. Not for this. That's the IS-3 shock. And it didn't stay in the intelligence files. It rewrote British tank doctrine for the next decade. The War Office response was immediate and, by peacetime procurement standards, remarkably fast. The requirement went out for a heavy gun tank, not a replacement for the Centurion, but a specialist partner that would sit alongside it in armoured regiments with one specific job: kill the IS-3 at range, from positions the IS-3's own 122mm couldn't effectively answer. The weapon that would do the killing didn't exist yet. It had to be invented. The Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment at Fort Halstead in Kent took the problem. What emerged from that facility in the late 1940s was the L11 120mm rifled gun, Britain's first tank gun of that calibre, and a weapon that represented a genuine engineering leap. The 20-pounder was an 83.4mm weapon. Going to 120mm wasn't just scaling up. The pressures involved in firing a round of that size from a rifled bore demanded new steel alloys for the barrel, new breech mechanisms to handle the separate loading ammunition. The round was too large and heavy to load as a single piece, so the projectile went in first, then the bagged propellant charge behind it, and new recoil systems to absorb forces that would have torn the mounting out of any existing turret. The gun was designed around the ammunition, and the ammunition was designed around the IS-3's armour. Specifically, two types: APDS, armour-piercing discarding sabote, for punching through at close range with raw kinetic energy, and HESH for killing at distance where the kinetic option lost its edge. The whole system went into the FV-214 Conqueror, which entered service with BAOR, the British Army of the Rhine, in 1955. And from that moment until the type was withdrawn a decade later, its crews trained to fight the Third World War. Not a skirmish, not a proxy conflict. The war. BAOR wasn't a peacekeeping force or a diplomatic gesture. It was a tripwire and a shield. British armour sat on the North German plain because that was where Soviet planning assumed the Third Shock Army would come through, and everyone in those tanks knew it. The Conqueror's job was specific and grim. Engage IS-3s and the newer T-10 heavy tanks at ranges beyond 2,000 metres, using the L1's accuracy and the HESH round's range-independent lethality to thin the assault columns before they reached the lighter Centurions. This was the plan for World War III, not theoretical, rehearsed week after week on the firing ranges and training grounds of West Germany, by men who expected to execute it for real within their tour of duty. They never did. And for 60 years, nobody could tell them whether it would have worked. The whole argument rests on a single gun lineage, and if this lineage doesn't hold, nothing else matters. So it needs to be walked through with precision. The Conqueror mounted the L1 120mm rifled gun. When the Chieftain replaced both the Conqueror and the Centurion in the mid-1960s, it mounted the L11A5, a direct evolution. Same 120mm calibre, same rifled bore, same separate loading ammunition configuration. Projectile first, bagged charge after. The metallurgy improved. The barrel life increased. The ammunition evolved through successive marks. But the fundamental system, a 120mm rifled tube firing HESH and kinetic energy rounds, stayed in the family. Challenger 1 inherited the L11A5 unchanged when it entered service in 1983. This wasn't coincidence or sentimentality. Britain committed to the 120mm rifled bore because the entire ammunition development program, decades of investment in HESH and kinetic energy projectiles, depended on that bore. Every NATO ally went smooth. Germany's Rheinmetall 120mm smoothbore became the standard on the Leopard 2 and the American Abrams. Britain stuck with rifling, and the reason was HESH. A smoothbore gun can't spin-stabilize a HESH round properly. The squash head needs the rotation imparted by rifling to spread evenly on impact. So Britain kept the rifled bore from the Conqueror all the way to the Challenger 2, specifically because HESH demanded it. So when a Challenger 1 of the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards fired an L31 HESH round at an Iraqi tank in February 1991, it was firing the direct ballistic descendant of what the Conqueror carried in West Germany. Not an analogy, not a rough comparison, a descendant. Improved propellant, tighter manufacturing tolerances, but the same weapon doing the same thing to the same type of armour. That's the connective tissue. Everything else follows from it. But first, the mechanism. Because that word melted from the comment section, the one that kicked off 39 replies and nearly 40% of all measurable engagement on the original video, isn't technically accurate. And it isn't wrong either. It captures something about what HESH does that the clinical language misses entirely. HESH, High Explosive Squash Head, and we'll use the acronym from here, doesn't penetrate armour, not in the conventional sense. It doesn't punch through like an armour-piercing, fin-stabilised, discarding sabot round. Doesn't burn through like a shaped charge. Here's what it actually does, and understanding the mechanism is essential because it explains why HESH was so perfectly suited to the job the Conqueror needed doing. A HESH round carries a filling of plastic explosive, typically an RDX and TNT composition, inside a thin, ductile metal shell designed to deform on impact rather than shatter. When it hits an armor plate, the casing collapses. The plastic explosive spreads out, squashes against the outer surface of the steel, forming a disc of explosive pressed flat against the plate like a pancake. A base fuse with a fractional delay then detonates the whole mass from behind. The detonation doesn't blast through the plate. It sends a compressive shockwave propagating through the steel at the speed of sound in that medium. When that shockwave reaches the inner surface of the armor, it reflects. And here's the physics that matters: as a tensile wave. Homogeneous steel is immensely strong in compression. In tension, it's comparatively brittle. The reflected tensile force exceeds the steel's ultimate tensile strength, and a scab of metal tears free from the inside face of the plate, fragmenting into jagged pieces that ricochet around the crew compartment at velocities no human body can survive. The crew doesn't see a hole appear in their armor. They experience a sudden, catastrophic eruption of metal fragments from what was, a millisecond earlier, the intact inner wall of their own tank. Instruments, ammunition, hydraulic lines, human beings. Everything inside gets hit simultaneously by what amounts to a fragmentation grenade generated from the tank's own hull. The armor becomes the weapon. That's why melted resonated. The tank doesn't break open, it destroys itself from the inside. Two properties of this mechanism matter enormously for the Conqueror's story. First, HESH effectiveness doesn't decrease significantly with range, unlike kinetic energy penetrators whose performance degrades as velocity bleeds off over distance. The L-31 round arriving at 3,000 meters carries the same 4 to 5 kilograms of plastic explosive as one arriving at 1,000. The damage depends on the explosive mass and the armor composition, not the residual velocity at impact. At the ranges, BAOR planners expected to engage Soviet heavy tanks, 2,000 to 3,000 meters on the flat, open terrain of the North German plain. HESH actually becomes the superior choice against homogeneous steel targets, because the kinetic penetrator is losing effectiveness, while the HESH round isn't losing anything. Second, HESH is supremely effective against homogeneous steel armor, single composition rolled or cast plates with no composite layers, no reactive elements, no spall liners, which is precisely what the IS-3 was made of. Now, the evidence from the desert. The British 1st Armoured Division deployed to the Gulf with 157 Challenger 1 main battle tanks, organised across 2 brigade groups. Brigadier Patrick Cordingley commanded the 7th Armoured Brigade, the Desert Rats, which included the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards and the Queen's Royal Irish Hussars under Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Denaro. The 4th Armoured Brigade, including the 14th/20th King's Hussars, formed the second arm. The ground war phase of Operation Granby began on 24 February 1991. It lasted roughly 100 hours. In that compressed window, British armour executed a sweeping left-hook flanking manoeuvre through southern Iraq and met Soviet-designed tanks head-on. The bulk of the Iraqi armoured fleet comprised T-55s and Chinese-derived Type 69s, both representing 1950s-era Soviet design philosophy with homogeneous steel armour. The T-55's hull front glacis is 100 mm of rolled homogeneous armour set at 60 degrees, creating roughly 200 mm of effective line-of-sight thickness. Turret front, cast steel, 200 mm at the thickest point. The Type 69, a Chinese variant of the T-54/55 family, carries broadly similar protection. Against these vehicles, HESH was devastating. Not adequate, devastating. Over the course of the ground war, the 1st Armoured Division claimed destruction of roughly 300 Iraqi armoured vehicles. Not one Challenger 1 was lost to enemy fire. Not one. That record still stands as one of the most lopsided in modern armoured warfare. British ammunition doctrine for Challenger 1 during Operation Granby specified a mixed load. The L-23 APF-SDS tungsten long rod penetrator as the primary anti-armour round, with some tanks carrying the newer L-26 Charm 1 round using depleted uranium. But the L-31 HESH was carried in significant quantities and valued for its extraordinary versatility. It could defeat armour, destroy bunkers and fortifications, suppress infantry positions, demolish structures. Against T-55s and Type 69s, HESH wasn't just a backup option, it was a primary killer. Engagement reports describe catastrophic internal damage to target vehicles, turrets displaced, ammunition cook-offs triggered not by penetration of the armour, but by the spalling effect, turning hull interiors into kill zones. British tank crews used HESH with confidence against these targets at ranges between 1,500 and 3,000 metres, precisely because the homogeneous steel armour on these vehicles was the type HESH was designed to defeat. Denaro's Queen's Royal Irish Hussars confirmed HESH as a major component of their ammunition expenditure against armoured and fortified targets throughout the advance. The famous long-range kill by a Challenger, one of C Squadron, Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, 5,100 metres, the longest confirmed tank-on-tank kill at that time, was almost certainly made with an APF-SDS round, given the extreme distance. But that record-breaking shot isn't the data point that answers our question. The hundreds of engagements at 1,500 to 3,000 metres where HESH consistently annihilated Soviet-designed steel armour, those are the data points. Because those are the ranges, and that's the armour type that the Conqueror was built to fight. And then there were the T-72 M1s. Iraq fielded the T-72 M1, an export variant, sometimes called the monkey model, because it was downgraded from what the Soviet army kept for itself. And this is where you need to understand how the Soviet export system actually worked, because it explains both why the Gulf War data is valid and where its limits are. Moscow didn't sell its best kit, not to anyone. Soviet export doctrine operated on a tiered system. The latest armour, fire control and ammunition stayed with the group of Soviet forces in Germany and the elite guards divisions. Export clients, even Warsaw Pact allies, even the East Germans, received downgraded variants with simplified fire control, inferior armour arrays and older ammunition. Iraq, a non-Warsaw Pact client, purchasing through state-to-state arms deals, sat even lower on that hierarchy. What Saddam's tank corps received was hardware the Soviets considered expendable in geopolitical terms. Good enough to project power in a regional context, never good enough to match what the Red Army itself fielded. Post-war technical exploitation teams found that Iraqi T-72 M1s had inferior composite arrangements in the hull front, with some vehicles containing only mild steel or poorly manufactured substitute fillers instead of the Soviet specification Textilite laminate. The turret was cast steel, reaching 280 to 410 mm across the frontal arc, depending on measurement point, with the thickest area around the turret cheeks. Hull sides were 80 mm. And here's a detail that matters enormously. No Iraqi T-72 during the Gulf War is confirmed to have carried explosive reactive armour, despite ERA kits being available in Soviet service since 1985. Iraq either wasn't offered ERA or didn't fit it. Either way, those tanks went into battle with naked steel. Against the T-72 M1's homogeneous steel areas, the 80mm hull sides, the cast turret sections away from the composite augmented cheeks, HESH performed exactly as theory predicted. Catastrophic internal fragmentation. Scab detachment from the inner armour face. Secondary detonation of stored ammunition triggered by the shrapnel storm inside the hull. These weren't marginal kills or lucky shots. They were the systematic confirmation of a damage mechanism that had been theorized, tested against static plates, and debated in classified assessments for 40 years. Now proved in the field against real armour on real vehicles. So now we turn to the target the Conqueror was actually built to kill. The IS-3, Object 703, designed at the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant under chief designer Nikolai Dukov. The tank that started all of this, when 52 of them rolled through Berlin on the 7th of September 1945, and made every Western tank obsolete overnight. Its armour profile was the specific problem the L120mm gun was designed to solve. And we need to walk through it, section by section, because the whole vindication stands or falls on this comparison. The pike nose. Two 110mm rolled homogeneous armour plates joined at a sharp central ridge, angled so steeply that an incoming round meets the surface at extreme obliquity. Effective thickness from dead ahead, 220 to 250 millimeters, depending on the exact angle of approach. The turret, a cast steel hemisphere, 220 to 250 millimeters at the thickest frontal point, tapering to 150 to 170 millimeters on the sides. Hull sides, 90 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armour. Hull rear, 60 millimeters. Every single surface, pure steel. No composite layers. No reactive armour, ERA, wouldn't exist for another 4 decades. No spall liners. No applique packages. From a HESH perspective, the IS-3 is an ideal target in every zone except one. That one zone is the pike nose, and this script won't flinch from it. HESH requires the plastic explosive to squash flat against the armour surface before detonation. At extreme oblique angles, and the IS-3's pike nose presents some of the most extreme obliquity on any production tank ever built, there's a genuine risk the round deflects or skips rather than deforming against the plate. If the explosive disc can't form, the spalling mechanism fails. Full stop. That's a real limitation, and it's the strongest technical argument against a frontal HESH kill on an IS-3 from dead ahead. 2 caveats. First, the pike nose geometry means any approach angle even slightly off the centerline dramatically changes the impact geometry on one or both plates, reducing the effective obliquity. Perfectly head-on shots in real combat are rare. A few degrees of offset changes the equation entirely. Second, the turret front, 220 to 250 millimeters of cast steel, not angled to the same extreme degree, would allow HESH to squash and detonate normally. Cast armour is somewhat less resistant to spalling than rolled plate, due to its internal grain structure, which actually works in the round's favour here. Whether a 120mm HESH round with 4 to 5 kilograms of explosive generates a lethal scab through 220mm of cast steel is genuinely debatable. Some assessments put the reliable spalling threshold at roughly 150mm of homogeneous steel, while others extend that figure when accounting for cast armour's inferior metallurgical consistency. What isn't debatable is this. The IS-3's hull sides at 90mm, turret sides at 150 to 170mm, and hull rear at 60mm are all well within HESH's demonstrated capability, comprehensively within it. A flank or rear engagement, exactly the kind of engagement tank doctrine actively sought to create, the kind Barr trained for relentlessly on the North German plain, would have been catastrophic for the IS-3. At 90mm, the scab formation would be violent and immediate. At 60mm on the rear, the round wouldn't just spall the armour, it might blow clean through. Here's where intellectual honesty earns its keep. Comparing Iraqi T-72 M1s destroyed in Kuwait to a hypothetical engagement between a Conqueror and an IS-3 on the North German plain in 1958 isn't a perfect equivalence. This script doesn't pretend otherwise. They're different vehicles from different decades with different design philosophies. The T-72 M1 is a medium tank of 41 tons with composite armour elements and an autoloader. The IS-3 is a heavy tank of 46 tons with pure steel armour, a 4-man crew, and that pike nose that has no equivalent in Iraq's fleet. The comparison is strong in these specific areas. The T-55, which British forces engaged in the greatest numbers and which HESH defeated comprehensively, has frontal protection of roughly 200mm effective on the turret, broadly comparable to the IS-3's turret front. The T-55's protection is actually comparable to or slightly thicker relative to the IS-3's 90mm hull sides. Where a T-55 was destroyed by HESH, an IS-3 engaged in the same area with the same round would have suffered comparable or greater damage. The T-72 M1's homogeneous steel areas, hull sides at 80mm, cast turret sections away from the composite augmented cheeks, are also comparable to or thinner than the IS-3's equivalent zones. Every one of those areas was proved vulnerable to 120mm HESH in combat. The comparison weakens against the pike nose specifically because no Iraqi tank presented an equivalent geometry. And it weakens further if you try to push the argument beyond the Conqueror's actual service window. And this is where the timeline becomes critical. By the mid-1980s, Soviet tanks carried Contact 1 ERA, tiles containing an explosive layer sandwiched between metal plates, bolted to the hull and turret exterior. When a HESH round strikes an ERA-equipped surface, the reactive tile detonates outward, physically disrupting the pancake of plastic explosive before it can detonate in proper contact with the base armour. Without that contact, the shockwave cannot propagate cleanly into the armour plate, and spalling is either eliminated or reduced to non-lethality. ERA doesn't just reduce HESH effectiveness, it can negate it entirely. Against a T-72B fitted with Contact 1 or a T-80U carrying the heavier Contact 5, HESH becomes a fundamentally different proposition. Which is one reason every other NATO nation abandoned HESH and went to smoothbore guns firing kinetic penetrators and shaped charges that ERA handles differently. But here's the thing. In the Conqueror's actual service period, 1955 to 1966, none of this existed. ERA was decades away. Composite armour was still a laboratory concept. The IS-3 had nothing but steel plates and the crew behind them. And the 120mm HESH round was specifically, precisely, forensically optimized to destroy exactly that. The comparison is strong but not airtight. and it's stronger than anyone has put on record until now. One more thread to pull. The original Tank Museum video mentioned that the Conqueror pioneered a hunter-killer fire control arrangement. Commander independently acquires targets through his own cupola and rangefinder, while the gunner engages another. Then it said this concept became common to most main battle tanks. Left it right there. No names, no system designations. The comment section did the rest, with viewers independently filling in Abrams, CITV, Challenger. So let's do what that video didn't. The Conqueror's commander sat in a cupola fitted with its own rangefinder and observation optics, physically independent from the gunner's sighting system. This meant the commander could traverse his cupola, scanning a different sector entirely, identifying the next threat while the gunner was still engaging the current one. When the commander found a target, he could designate it, hand it off to the gunner, without both men having to look through the same sight. 2 sets of eyes, 2 sectors covered, 1 tank doing the work of 2. In the chaos of an armoured engagement, where targets appear and disappear in seconds, where smoke and dust obscure the battlefield, and you're fighting vehicles that shoot back, the difference between sequential target acquisition and simultaneous target acquisition is the difference between surviving the second engagement and dying in it. That concept fed directly into British fire control development. The Chieftain got the improved fire control system. That evolved into Challenger 1's Thermal Observation Gunnery Sight, TOGS, which gave the gunner a thermal imaging capability for night and degraded visibility fighting, while the commander retained independent observation. Challenger 2 carries TOGS-2, a further refinement. On the American side, the M1A2 Abrams carries the Commander's Independent Thermal Viewer, CITV, which does precisely the same thing. Lets the commander scan for threats in thermal while the gunner fights the battle in front of him. Same concept, different engineering. Both trace back through the same family tree the Conqueror planted. You already knew that. The original video just didn't say it out loud. Which brings us to the men. The Conqueror served primarily with the 5th Royal Tank Regiment and the 7th Royal Tank Regiment in West Germany, and most of the men inside those turrets weren't career soldiers. They were National Service conscripts, 18 and 19 years old, 2 mandatory years in uniform, and for those posted to BAOR, those 2 years were spent on what everyone quietly understood was the front line of a war that could start on any given Tuesday. Think about what that actually meant. You're 19. 6 months ago, you were working in a shop, or finishing an apprenticeship, or waiting for your papers. Now you're inside 65 tons of steel on the North German plain, learning to load a 120mm round in a turret that veterans described as isolating, sealed off from daylight, sealed off from the outside world, just the gun, the loader's tray, the bagged charges, and the voice of your commander in the intercom telling you the Soviet Third Shock Army is 6 hours from the border. Every week you drill, load, fire, reload, acquire, designate, engage. You get good at it. You might even get proud of it. And then your 2 years are up and you go home. Back to civilian life. Back to the shop, the trade, the ordinary world. And nobody ever tells you whether any of it mattered. Whether the thing you trained to do would have worked. Whether the 65-tonne machine you poured 2 years of your youth into was actually capable of doing the one thing it existed to do. There's no combat record to point to, no battle honour to hang on the wall. Just a service number, a discharge paper, and a question that never got answered. That question followed those men home. Some of them are still alive, many aren't. Their children and grandchildren inherited the question without ever quite knowing how to phrase it. Here's the answer. If your father or grandfather served on Conquerors in BAOR Germany, here's what his tank would have done. At 3,000 meters, well within the L1's effective range, on terrain that offered clear sightlines for exactly that kind of shot, a 120mm HESH round striking the IS-3's turret side at 150 to 170mm of cast steel would have sent a compressive shock wave through the plate, reflected it as a tensile wave off the inner surface, and blown a scab of jagged metal fragments through the crew compartment at killing velocity. At 90mm on the hull sides, the IS-3 wouldn't have stood a chance. At 60mm on the rear, it would have been annihilation. The pike nose from dead ahead? Honest answer? Probably not a clean kill with HESH. Maybe a deflection, maybe partial detonation, maybe an effect short of catastrophic spalling. But tank crews don't line up for jousting matches. They maneuver for flank shots. They use terrain and formation tactics to create the angles they need. And at any angle that isn't perfectly head-on, the Conqueror's 120mm HESH round would have done exactly what it was designed to do. Your grandfather's tank would have done its job. The Gulf War proved the mechanism. The gun lineage confirms the capability. The armour comparison, honest caveats and all, supports the conclusion. The only thing missing was the war itself, and we should all be grateful it never came. About 180 Conquerors were built. A handful survive. Most of them sit as gate guards now. 65-tonne steel sentinels parked outside military bases, many of which have themselves been decommissioned and closed. Paint flaking in long pale strips, rust creeping into the turret rings and the mantlet castings. The L1 gun tubes that once carried the answer to the IS-3 shock pointed at nothing, slowly oxidizing in English rain or, for those few that made it to museum halls like Bovington, preserved under roofs but still silent, still waiting, their bores cold for over half a century. 4 viewers on the original video flagged these surviving tanks. And there's something in that image that refuses to let go. These machines, sitting patiently in weeds and car parks, dismissed as curiosities, while the evidence that would have vindicated them and the men who crewed them sat buried in Gulf War after-action reports that nobody thought to hold up against a 1950s Soviet heavy tank's armour specifications. The Conqueror never fired in anger. The men who served on it never got their war. And they never got their proof. But the proof existed. It was generated in 100 hours of desert fighting in February 1991 by the grandchildren of their gun, firing the grandchildren of their ammunition against the same type of armour their rounds were built to kill. The evidence was always there, rusting quietly alongside the tanks themselves. If this answered a question you've been carrying, or one your family never got to ask, subscribe for more stories like this.